The station at Harrow Creek was the kind of place that made a person feel the full weight of how far they had come. It was a single platform of weathered planks, narrow enough that two people passing each other would have to turn sideways, with a tin roof that caught the wind and sang it back in low, mournful tones. A single lantern hung from a hook near the door of the station master's booth, its flame doing what it could against the dark. The surrounding land stretched out flat and wide in every direction, broken only by the distant suggestion of hills that the last of the evening light had already abandoned. There were no other passengers. There had not been for the last 2 stops. By the time the train breathed its final exhale of steam and shuddered to a halt, Wren Calloway was the only soul left in the car. She sat with her spine straight and her hands folded in her lap, a posture she had learned not from elegance but from necessity, the kind of discipline a woman builds when she has nothing left but the way she carries herself. Her coat was dark wool, brushed clean but beginning to show its age at the cuffs. Her traveling bag sat on the seat beside her, and tucked beneath it, flat and familiar, was a book. Not a novel, not a Bible, but a schoolroom reader. Its spine cracked from years of use, its pages softened at the corners by the hands of children who had once looked up at her and waited to be taught something worth knowing. It was the only thing she had kept. She rose, lifted the bag, kept the book beneath her arm, and stepped onto the platform. The wind came at her immediately, sharp and dry, carrying the smell of open land and something faintly mineral, like the earth here was a different composition than anything she had known before. She stood still for a moment and let it push against her. Then she looked for him. There was no one. The platform was empty in both directions. The station master's booth showed a thin line of light beneath its door, but the door itself was shut. Somewhere behind the station, a horse shifted in the dark and stamped once, and then the night went quiet again. Wren turned a slow circle, taking in the full absence of anyone who might have come to meet her, and then she set her bag down at her feet and waited. She was good at waiting. She had learned that too. An hour passed the way hours do when a person is alone in the dark with their own thoughts, slowly and not kindly. The lantern above her swayed in the wind, throwing unsteady light across the planks. She watched it rather than the road because the road had stopped producing anything worth watching. At some point she sat down on her bag, the book still under her arm, and allowed herself the small honesty of exhaustion, not despair. She was careful not to call it that. Just the particular weariness of a person who had been traveling for 3 days towards something she was not entirely certain existed. When the station master's door finally opened, a thin man in suspenders leaned out and squinted at her with the expression of someone who had forgotten she was there. "Train came through," he said, as though this required confirmation. "I'm aware," Wren said. "I was on it." He looked at her bag, then at the book under her arm, then at the road that led away from the station into the dark. "You waiting on someone?" "Cord Mallory," she said. "Duskwater Ranch." The man's face did something she would think about for a long time afterward. It didn't harden exactly, and it didn't soften. It rearranged itself into something careful, the way a person looks when they are deciding how much truth is appropriate for a stranger. He scratched the back of his neck and leaned against the door frame. "Mallory," he said, and then paused longer than the name required. "He don't come out much anymore. Hasn't met anybody at this station in—" He stopped, started again. "It's been a good while." Wren looked at him steadily. "How long a while?" The station master looked at the lantern rather than at her. 3 years, give or take. She received this information without expression. She was practiced at that too. Is there a way to reach the ranch from here on foot? He looked at her then, with something she might have called surprise if she'd been paying attention to it. It's near 4 miles out, ma'am. Road goes north past the grain house and then cuts west at the old fence post. You'd know it by the broken crossbeam. It's dark. I can see that, she said. I mean, it's not the kind of dark a woman ought to walk alone in. Wren picked up her bag and tucked the book more firmly under her arm. Point me north, she said. He did. The road was not much of a road. It was more of a suggestion. A path where the grass had given up trying to grow because enough boots and hooves had discouraged it over enough years. She walked it by the light of a sky that was, mercifully, clear, the stars dense and low in a way she had never seen before. In the place she came from, the sky at night was always dimmed by proximity to other lives, other lights, other people crowding in close. Here the stars seemed to have the whole sky to themselves, and they filled it accordingly. She did not think about where she had come from. She had made a deliberate practice of not doing that. She thought instead about the road ahead of her, about the way the wind moved through the grass on either side in long, slow waves, about the sound her boots made against the packed dirt, steady, unhurried, one after the other. She had walked harder roads than this. The hardest ones hadn't been paved with dirt at all. They had been paved with the particular silence of a room full of people who had already decided what they believed about you, and nothing you said was going to change it. She found the broken crossbeam post at a distance that suggested the station master had underestimated her pace. She turned west. The land opened up differently in this direction, wider and more exposed, and it was here that she first saw it. Not the ranch itself, but the lamp. A single light in the middle of all that dark, small, and warm, and entirely indifferent to her approach. Burning on because that was what lamps did, not because anyone had left it there for her. But she walked toward it all the same, because there was nothing else to walk toward. Duskwater Ranch announced itself gradually, rather than all at once. First the fence line emerged from the dark, running long and slightly irregular, some posts newer than others, the whole thing serviceable, but not tended to with any great pride. Then the shape of the barn, solid against the sky, its roofline clean. Then the house itself, low and long, built from timber that had earned its color from sun and seasons rather than paint. The covered porch running its full width. The lamp burning on a hook beside the front door. It was a real place. She had not entirely been certain it would be. She stopped at the edge of the yard, set her bag down, and straightened her coat with her free hand. Then she walked up to the front door and knocked. The wait was shorter than she expected. Boot steps, measured and deliberate, crossing a wooden floor. Then the door swung open, and Cord Mallory stood in the light. He was taller than she'd anticipated, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who worked land for a living rather than for appearance. His hair was dark, slightly overlong, and his face was the kind that had been shaped by weather and years into something that resisted easy reading, not closed exactly, but settled into a stillness that gave nothing away until it was ready to. He wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the cold. He held a coffee cup in one hand. He looked at her, then at the bag at her feet, then at the book under her arm, then back at her face. "You walked," he said. "It wasn't a question." "You weren't at the station," she said. That wasn't a question either. Something moved in his expression, brief and undecipherable, before it settled back into stillness. He looked past her at the dark road she had come in from, as if confirming it had in fact been walked in the dark and at this hour. Then he looked back at her. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. Wren held his gaze without difficulty. She had been looked at by harder eyes than his and had not looked away. "I didn't have anywhere else to go," she said. That's the honest answer. He considered this. The lamp beside him threw his shadow long and sideways across the porch boards. The wind moved through the yard behind her, pushing at the hem of her coat. "Come inside," he said, and stepped back from the door. The interior of the house was warm from a fire that had been burning long enough to push the cold back from the walls. She stepped in and took quiet stock of it the way she had learned to take stock of everything, efficiently, without appearing to look. A front room with a table, 2 chairs, a fireplace doing its work in the far wall. A kitchen through an open doorway, a short hall beyond that. The floors were clean. The surfaces were not cluttered. Everything was orderly in the manner of a person who had removed rather than collected, as if at some point things had been cleared away and never replaced. And then she saw it. In the far corner of the front room, set back from the firelight, was a cradle, small, handmade from a pale wood, with a curved base built for rocking. A length of white cloth had been draped over it, not carelessly, but with intention, as though covering something that was not to be looked at, or perhaps something that was not to be disturbed. The cloth was clean. Someone had kept it clean. The cradle itself had the particular stillness of something that had never been used. Wren looked at it for only a moment. Then she looked away. Cord had set his coffee cup on the table and was watching her without appearing to watch her, which told her he was better at reading rooms than he wanted her to know. Neither of them spoke about the cradle. Neither of them would, not that night, not for a long time after. But in the particular silence that followed, something passed between them that was its own kind of language, an acknowledgement without words. A mutual agreement to leave certain doors closed, at least for now. He showed her the small room at the end of the hall, a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a window that looked out over the side pasture, a peg on the wall for hanging things, a candle stub on the windowsill. Everything a person needed and nothing they didn't. "There's a latch on the inside," he said, indicating the door. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and pulled the door shut behind him. She stood in the small room and listened to his footsteps cross back down the hall, heard the scrape of a chair, the soft sound of him settling back into whatever the evening had been before she arrived. She set her bag on the chest of drawers. She placed the book on top of it, carefully, squarely, the way she placed it every night. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and let herself be still. She did not cry. She had not cried since the morning she left, and she had decided somewhere on the long journey west that she was finished with that. Not because the grief wasn't real. It was, in the complicated way of losing something that had already been taken from her before she left it, but because crying was for people who still had enough safe ground beneath them to afford it. What she had was a narrow bed, a latched door, and a man down the hall who had not come to meet her, and had said so with a plainness she almost respected. It was not nothing. She had started from less. Morning came gray and gradual, the light seeping in through the window over the pasture in slow stages. She was already awake when it arrived, had been for an hour, lying still in the unfamiliar room and mapping its sounds. The creak of the house in the wind, the distant sound of horses, the particular quiet of land that had not yet decided what kind of day it intended to be. She dressed, pinned her hair, and went to the kitchen. The stove was cold. She found wood stacked near the back door, got the fire going with the efficiency of someone who had done it without help for most of her adult life, and set water to heat. By the time she had found flour and salt and the cast iron pan hanging on the wall, the kitchen had begun to warm. She did not know what she was making a home out of. She was not certain she was making anything yet, but she knew how to start a fire, and she knew how to feed people. And those two things had gotten her through enough mornings that she had stopped requiring a third thing before she could begin. She heard him before she saw him, the same measured boot steps from the night before, crossing the front room and pausing at the kitchen doorway. She didn't turn from the stove. "Coffee's nearly ready," she said. He came in and sat at the table without being invited, which told her he was a man who moved through his own house by habit rather than ceremony. She poured his coffee and set it in front of him, and then went back to the pan. They ate breakfast with the morning light coming in through the window and the sound of the wind picking up outside, and they did not talk much. And what talking they did was brief and practical. The horses, the well, where things were kept. But somewhere in the middle of it, between the second cup of coffee and the moment she began clearing the plates, Cord looked at her with a steadiness that had something measuring in it and said, "You cook like you've been doing it alone a long time." "I have," she said. He nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. He picked up his hat from the chair beside him, set it on his head, and went out to start the day. She watched him cross the yard from the kitchen window, hands in his coat pockets, moving toward the barn with the unhurried stride of a man who had been walking the same ground long enough that his feet knew the way without being asked. She watched until he disappeared into the barn's shadow, and then she turned back to the kitchen and began to learn it. She was still learning the kitchen. Which drawer stuck, which burner ran hot, where the previous occupant had kept the good knife. When she decided she needed to go into town, the pantry was thin. She had seen what it held and calculated what a week would require, and they were not the same number. She left a note on the table in case he came back early and wondered, and she walked to Harrow Creek along the same road she had come in on the night before, now visible and ordinary in the morning light. The broken crossbeam post at the turn looking nothing like it had in the dark. The town of Harrow Creek arranged itself along a single main street with the practical modesty of a place that had been built for use rather than impression. A mercantile, a grain and feed, a post office with a crooked sign, a few other storefronts behind wooden facades. She went to the mercantile first, basket over her arm, her list tucked in her coat pocket. The woman behind the counter looked up when she came in. The look lasted a moment too long before it resolved into something neutral and then into a small, polite smile. "Morning," Wren said. "I'm looking for flour, salt, dried beans if you have them. Lard." The woman's hands, which had been moving to reach beneath the counter, stopped. She looked at Wren for another moment with the expression of someone doing a quick and uncomfortable calculation. Then she said, "I'm sorry. I don't think I can help you today." Wren kept her voice even. "Is there a shortage?" "No, ma'am." "Is there a problem with my money? I have coin." The woman dropped her gaze to the counter. "I'm sorry," she said again, quieter this time, and in a way that almost sounded as though she meant it. Wren looked at her for a moment, not with anger, not yet, but with the particular attention of a woman who understood that the obstacle in front of her was not the one she was actually dealing with. Then she thanked the woman politely and went back out into the street. The grain and feed gave her a similar answer, delivered more briskly by a man who did not meet her eyes. The third door she tried, a small dry goods shop with a striped awning, didn't answer at all. She was standing on the boardwalk outside, basket still empty on her arm, recalibrating, when a hand closed around her wrist and tugged her sideways into the narrow gap between two buildings. She turned, ready, and found an old woman looking up at her with sharp eyes set in a face as weathered as the fence posts she had walked past that morning. "You came in on last night's train," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "You're out at Duskwater." "I am," Wren said. The old woman glanced at the street, then back at her. "Beckett Vane was in this town before your train arrived," she said. Her voice was low, steady, carrying the particular weight of someone who had decided that what they were saying mattered enough to say it carefully. "He spoke to the mercantile. He spoke to the feed. He spoke to anyone who does business with Duskwater or with anyone who does." Wren stood very still. "What did he say?" "He didn't have to say much." The old woman's eyes were clear and direct. Men like Vane rarely do. He just reminded people of what they owe him. And most people in this town owe him something. She paused. "Cora Hutchins at the mercantile. Her husband's note is held by Vane. The feed man's brother borrowed against next season's crop. You understand." Wren understood. She had encountered the architecture of this kind of pressure before, not in its exact form, but in its shape, which was always the same. A man standing just outside the frame of the thing he wanted, making sure the doors were locked before anyone tried to open them. "Who is he?" Wren asked. "In relation to Cord Mallory." The old woman looked at her for a moment as if deciding whether she had earned the answer. Then she said, "Eileen Mallory's older brother. Eileen was Cord's wife." She paused. "She died in childbed 3 winters back. The baby, too." Another pause, shorter. "Vane has never stopped blaming Cord for it." The street noise continued around the gap between the buildings. Unhurried, ordinary, indifferent to the weight of what had just been said. Wren stood in the small shadow and held what she had been given, and did not let her face show how much it had landed. "Thank you," she said, because the woman had taken a risk to tell her, and that deserved acknowledgement. The old woman shook her head once. "Don't thank me. Just be careful." She squeezed Wren's arm briefly, and then stepped back out onto the boardwalk and walked away as if they had never spoken. Wren stayed in the gap between the buildings for a moment longer, alone, the basket empty on her arm and the name Beckett Vane settling into her mind alongside everything else she had just learned about the place she had come to. She knew the name now. She knew its shape. She knew what it had been doing to Duskwater before she arrived. And she knew, without needing to be told, that her arrival had not gone unnoticed by the man who wielded it. She walked back to Duskwater the long way, past the edge of the grazing land where the light was better and the wind came clean off the open flats. She did not rush. Rushing was for people who were afraid, and she had decided somewhere on the long walk between the third closed door and the old woman's grip on her wrist that she was not going to be afraid. Not of empty baskets and not of men who locked doors before you reached them. She had come from a place where all the doors had been locked. She was still here. The ranch came into view ahead of her, sitting low and solid against the late morning sky. She could see the barn doors open, a horse moving slowly in the outer corral, the smoke from the kitchen chimney still trailing thin from the fire she had started that morning. Her fire, in his kitchen, on this particular stretch of land that a man named Beckett Vane had spent 3 years trying to make uninhabitable. Wren walked through the gate and up to the house and set the empty basket inside the door. Then she went to the kitchen table and sat down and placed the book in front of her, the schoolroom reader, its spine cracked and its pages worn. And she put both hands flat on it and looked at it for a long moment. She had carried it out of the only life she had known because she believed that what was inside it still mattered. That words, taught carefully to people who needed them, were a form of protection. That knowing how to read the room you were in, how to see what was written in the pauses and the prices and the too long looks, was the closest thing to power a woman in her position was likely to get. She had been run out of one place for knowing how to read rooms. She did not intend to let it happen twice. Outside, the wind moved through the yard with the easy confidence of something that had been here long before any of them and would remain long after. Somewhere near the barn, boots crossed gravel, steady, unhurried, familiar already in their rhythm. Cord Mallory, moving through his own land, carrying whatever he carried, unaware that the woman sitting in his kitchen had just come back from a town that had been told to turn her away, and had decided, in the gap between two buildings, that she was going to stay anyway. The book sat beneath her hands, solid and warm from the distance she had carried it. She stayed. The days that followed did not announce themselves as anything significant. They arrived the way days do on working land, early, gray at the edges, practical in their demands. And they asked nothing of Wren and Cord except that they get through them, which both of them did, in their separate ways, without much discussion about it. Wren had expected resistance. She had lived long enough to know that resistance was the default condition of people who had arranged their lives around a particular kind of absence, and Cord Mallory had clearly arranged his with considerable care. The house ran on the logic of someone who had stripped away everything that required another person to maintain it. Nothing that spoiled quickly, nothing that needed conversation, nothing that asked to be tended in any way that went beyond the purely mechanical. He had built a life that could be managed alone, and he had been managing it alone for long enough that the shape of it had set, like plaster in a mold. And yet he did not tell her to leave. He was not rude. She had braced for rudeness and found instead a species of distance that was in some ways harder to navigate because it gave her nothing to push against. He answered when spoken to. He ate what she cooked without complaint. He held the door when they moved through the same space at the same time. And he said good morning with the regularity of a man who had decided that much at least was owed. But he moved through the house and the land as if she were a fixed point he had already mapped and now moved around by habit, acknowledged, accounted for, not quite seen. She had been not quite seen before. She knew how to work inside it. She learned the ranch the way she had always learned things, by paying attention to what was actually there rather than what she expected to find. The fence line on the east side needed work, 2 posts leaning and one completely down, the wire sagging in a long loop along the ground. She noted it without comment. The well ran slightly slow in the mornings, better by midday, which she adjusted her water drawing schedule around without being asked. The stove burned hot on the left and cool on the right, which was why the first batch of biscuits came out uneven and why the second batch did not. These were small things. She was not under any illusion that small things were enough. But small things were what she had, and she had learned a long time ago that a person who waits for large things to begin with rarely begins at all. It was on the 4th morning that she found Eli. He appeared at the edge of the yard just after breakfast, hovering at the fence line with the particular hesitance of a child who has been told not to bother someone and is trying to determine exactly where the boundary of bothering begins. He was perhaps 8 years old, slight, with a serious face, and the careful eyes of a boy who had been paying attention to adult conversations longer than adults had realized. His boots were too large. His coat was missing a button at the top. Wren was carrying a bucket from the well when she saw him. She stopped. "You're early," she said. He blinked. "Ma'am? Whoever sent you? It's early for a visit." "Nobody sent me," he said, with the dignity of someone making an important distinction. "I came myself. My pa works the cattle on the north pasture. I come with him sometimes." He looked at her with a directness that reminded her of the students she had liked best, the ones who had not yet learned to hide how much they wanted to know things. "Are you the teacher?" he asked. Wren set the bucket down. "Where did you hear that?" "Pa said a woman came out to Duskwater. He said she came from the east. He said Easterners mostly know how to read." He paused. "I can read some, not all." Wren looked at him for a moment. The morning light was coming in low and pale across the yard, and somewhere in the barn behind her she could hear the regular rhythm of cord working. A sound she had already learned to locate without thinking about it, the way you learn to locate any sound that tells you where another person is. She thought about the empty mercantile basket. She thought about all the things she had carried with her that she had not yet found a use for. "What's your name?" she asked. "Eli Craster," he said. "Eli," she picked up the bucket. "Come inside." She simply put the book on the table and opened it to the beginning and sat across from the boy, and they went through it together. Slowly at first, then with the gathering speed of someone who has not been shown the right door yet, and suddenly finds it open. He knew more than he had let on. Children often did. They undersold themselves to protect against the particular pain of trying and being found wanting. And when they discovered that the person across from them was not in the business of finding fault, they opened up with a thoroughness that could be startling. By the time Cord came in from the barn for the midday break, Wren and Eli were deep in the middle of a page about a river and a boat, and the boy was reading aloud with his finger tracking each word, and his face wearing the expression of someone doing something real. Cord stopped in the kitchen doorway. He did not say anything. He stood for a moment in the way that big, quiet men sometimes stand, very still, as if stillness were a way of seeing better. And he looked at the table and the book, and the boy reading, and the woman beside him, and then he turned and went back out without making himself coffee first, which was something he never skipped. Wren saw it. She said nothing. She kept her attention on Eli and the river and the boat, and she let Cord have whatever he needed to do with what he had just seen. That evening, after Eli had gone back to his father and the supper dishes were done, she found a new candle on the table beside the book. Not the stub she had been making do with. A full candle, unlit, placed squarely where she would see it. She picked it up and looked at it for a moment. Then she put it in the holder and lit it, and went on with the evening. She did not say thank you. She understood by then that he would not know what to do with it. Beckett Vane came to Duskwater on the 6th day. She heard him before she saw him. Hoofbeats in the yard, more than one horse, arriving without the hesitance that announced a neighborly call, and with the easy authority of a man who had been riding onto this property whenever he saw fit for long enough that he had stopped thinking of it as anyone else's. She was in the side yard, beating dust from a blanket she had hung over the fence rail when the horses came through the gate. There were two of them, Vane on a tall gray, and a younger man slightly behind him who had the watchful stillness of someone paid to have it. Vane himself was a large man, not in height, but in the way he occupied space. Broad-chested, immaculately turned out, with a coat that had not been bought in any town within riding distance of Harrow Creek, and boots that had not seen a working day in years, if ever. He had a full head of silver hair and the kind of face that had been handsome once and knew it, the features sharpened now into something that read as authority and functioned as warning. He looked at her with the particular quality of attention that men like him gave to things that had appeared in places where they had not expected things to appear. "Miss Calloway," he said, and the fact that he knew her name had the shape of a thing he wanted her to notice. She stopped beating the blanket and looked at him without hurry. "Mr. Vane," she said, because the old woman had told her his name and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Something moved briefly in his expression, acknowledgement, recalculation, and then it smoothed back into the pleasant, considered expression of a man who had learned that pleasantness cost nothing and bought considerable goodwill among people who weren't paying close enough attention. "I heard you'd arrived," he said, settling comfortably in the saddle the way a man settles into a chair he considers his own. "Thought I'd come by, welcome you properly." His gaze moved over the side yard, the house, the beaten blanket on the fence rail. With the proprietary ease of someone conducting an inspection they have the right to conduct. "Cord not about?" "He's working," she said. "Of course he is." Vane smiled. It was a practiced smile, comfortable and warm at its surface, and absolutely empty of warmth beneath. "He's always working. That's always been Cord's way. Head down, no matter what." He paused in a way that was not really a pause at all, but a delivery mechanism for what came next. "It's an admirable quality. In some circumstances." Wren looked at him steadily and waited. "I wanted to come by personally," Vane continued, "to make sure you understood the situation here. New arrivals sometimes don't have the full picture." He looked at her with an expression that might have passed for concern among people who had not spent time around men who wore concern the way they wore good coats. For appearance, not warmth. "Duskwater has been struggling for some time. Cord is a good man in his way, but he's been diminished, you might say, by grief, by circumstance. The ranch has suffered for it." He let that sit for a moment. "I'd hate for a woman in your position to invest herself in something that isn't in a condition to support her." "My position," Wren said. "You've come a long way," he said, with a gentle sympathy that made her jaw want to tighten. "On the basis of an arrangement with a man who hasn't been himself in years. I'd simply want you to have a clear view of what you've come to before you settle in too completely." Wren put the beating stick down and gave him the full attention that the speech appeared to be asking for. She had heard variations of this kind of talk before. The pleasant-voiced warning that dressed itself as concern for your well-being, and was in fact a very precise measurement of how much of a problem you were going to be. The measurement was always embedded in the smile, in the particular quality of the pause, in the way they said your name at the beginning to establish that they knew it. "Thank you for the welcome," she said, "and for your concern." He waited with the patience of a man accustomed to being deferred to. "I'll see to my own view of things," she said. The pleasant expression did not leave his face. It stayed perfectly in place, which was somehow more concerning than if it had slipped. He looked at her for a moment with eyes that were doing something very different from what the rest of his face was doing, and then he said lightly, "Of course." He gathered his reins. "I hope you'll find the country to your liking." He touched the brim of his hat. Do give Cord my regards." He turned the gray horse and rode back through the gate, the younger man falling in behind him, and the yard returned to its ordinary sounds, wind and horses and the distant work of the ranch. As if Beckett Vane had not just walked the edge of something and made sure she felt how close it was. She picked up the beating stick and finished the blanket. Cord came in from the north pasture late that afternoon, and she told him plainly over supper that Vane had come by. She watched his face as she said it, the slight tightening around the jaw, the way his hands, which had been resting easy on the table, went still. He did not ask her what was said. She told him anyway, briefly and without editorializing, because she thought he deserved the accuracy. When she finished, he said, "He's always come when he sees fit." His voice was level. "Since Eileen died, it started as—" He stopped, began again, more carefully. "He needed someone to hold responsible. I understood that. In the beginning." He turned his coffee cup with one hand, not drinking from it. "It's been 3 years." Wren said nothing. She let the silence have its proper duration. "He's not wrong that the ranch has suffered," Cord said after a moment. "Not as a concession to Vane, but as a private accounting, the kind a man makes when he has decided that someone across the table from him can be trusted with it. I let things go. After." He did not say after what. He did not need to. "It takes more than one person to run this land properly. I knew that. I just—" He looked at the coffee cup. "Stopped caring enough to do anything about it." "And now?" Wren said. He looked up at her then, in that steady, direct way he had, the way that felt less like looking and more like taking measure, though not unkindly. "You showed up," he said. "That changed the arithmetic. It was not poetry. It was a man telling her, in the most practical terms available to him, that her presence had altered something in the calculation of his days. She understood the language it was spoken in because it was the same language she used herself, the language of people who had been surviving long enough that they had stopped adorning the truth and simply handed it over, plain. She nodded once and cleared the plates. The next several days moved with the particular quality of time that is quietly busy rather than loudly eventful. Wren established a morning rhythm at the ranch, and an afternoon one in the yard, where Eli had started coming more regularly, and where he had now been joined by 2 girls from a neighboring property whose mother had appeared one evening at the fence line with a pot of preserved fruit, and said very little except that her daughters had heard there was reading going on, and she thought that was a fine thing. Wren arranged 3 chairs in the side yard on days the weather held, and they worked through the book section by section. The girls, Nessa and her younger sister Ruth, who was 6 and had not yet learned that questions could be embarrassing, asked very different questions than Eli did, and all 3 of them were further along by the end of the week than they had been at the beginning. Cord watched this from a careful distance. On the mornings he rode out late enough to see it, or on the evenings he came in early enough to catch the last of it. He did not comment. But one morning she found that the fence on the side of the yard had been fixed, 2 new posts, the wire retightened, which meant the children's chairs would no longer need to be repositioned to avoid the section that had been leaning. She noted it the way she noted all of it, filed it away with the candle and the door held open, and the way he kept his voice low when he spoke near her, as if he had made some early and private decision about how much space he was going to take up in her vicinity. It was on the 8th morning that she went to the doctor. She told herself she was going to ask about a liniment for one of the horses, which was true enough to make the trip honest. Old Haber ran a small practice out of a building at the far end of Harrow Creek's main street, above which hung a wooden sign that had once been painted with letters and was now mostly suggestions of them. He was a thin man, slightly stooped, with the slow-moving precision of someone who had learned over decades not to rush the things that mattered. He had delivered most of the children in the valley and buried more people than he liked to count, and he wore both pieces of knowledge with the tired equanimity of someone who had made a long peace with the full range of what life did. He gave her the liniment, and she paid for it, and she was nearly to the door when he said, without her asking, "You're out at Duskwater, Cord Mallory's place." "I am," she said, and turned back. He was looking at her with an expression that was not quite reluctant and not quite ready, something between the two, like a man standing at the edge of something he has been standing at the edge of for a long time. He set down the pen in his hand. "I heard a woman came out on the contract," he said carefully. "Figured you'd come by sooner or later." He looked at his hands, then at the wall, then at her. Eileen Mallory's labor, the night she died. He spoke carefully, the way people speak when they have rehearsed something for a very long time and are not entirely sure it will hold together once it leaves their mouth. It was a complication that no one could have anticipated, not with any examination, not with any skill. It came fast, and it came hard, and there was nothing to be done for it once it came. He paused. Cord brought her in when he should have, before he should have, if anything. He had her in my office before it was even certain there was cause for alarm. Another pause, longer. None of what followed was his fault. I've known that from the night it happened. Wren stood very still with the liniment in her hands and let him get through it. "I've kept a record," he said. "A medical record, which is what I'm required to keep. It documents what happened and when, and it's accurate, and it has been sitting in my files for 3 years. He finally looked at her directly. "Beckett Vane is a man who holds a great deal of what this town needs, and I am an old man who has always needed more courage than I have had." He stopped. His jaw moved slightly, as if he were deciding something, and then it settled. "I'm telling you this because you're new here, and because I'm tired. 3 years is a long time to be tired of something." She held his gaze. "Thank you," she said. As a recognition of what it had cost him to say it, he gave a small nod. "The record is there if it's ever needed. I'll stand by it." He paused. "I sent word to Marin Holst on the council this morning as well, before you arrived. She deserved to know too. She walked back to Duskwater with the liniment and the weight of what she'd been given. The information was real. The record was real. The 3 years of silence behind both of them were real. And somewhere on the land ahead of her was a man who had been carrying a weight that had never been his to carry, in a house where time had stopped at the worst possible moment and been held there by someone else's grief and someone else's need for blame. She had not come here intending to fight anyone's battles. She had come here because she had no other place to go. But she was beginning to understand the way she understood things that mattered, slowly and then all at once. That the place she had no other option but to come to had handed her something she had not expected. What it had handed her was purpose, the clear-edged, uncomplicated kind. She came through the gate and across the yard, and she stood there for a moment with the late afternoon light coming across the land in long, warm angles, and the sound of the children's voices still faint in her memory from the morning's lesson, and somewhere near the barn, the steady sound of cord working. She did not tell him any of it that evening. The moment was not right. She would know when. She was good at knowing when. What she did instead was put supper on and set 2 plates and sit across from him in the ordinary way they had fallen into. He asked, without quite looking at her, how the trip into town had gone. She said, "Fine, I got what I needed." And that was true enough to be worth saying. He nodded and went back to his plate. The candle she had lit, the full one he had left for her, burned between them on the table, steady and unhurried, as if it had all the time in the world. She looked at him, at the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders and the hands around the coffee cup, the ring still on the 4th finger of his left hand, worn and plain and daily. He wore it because he had not yet decided what it meant to stop wearing it. She understood that. She understood almost all of it now. Wren picked up her fork and finished her supper and let the candle burn. The days had a different quality now. Not warmer exactly, not easier. The wind still came hard off the open land each morning, and the work was still the work, demanding and indifferent to how a person felt about doing it. But something in the atmosphere of Duskwater had shifted in the way that weather shifts before anyone can point to the exact moment it changed. A degree less of held breath. A fraction more of ease in the silences, which had always been plentiful between them, and which were beginning, gradually, to mean something different than absence. Cord had begun to linger at breakfast. Not long. 5 minutes, perhaps 10. But it was a change from the first week, when he had taken his coffee standing and been out the door before she had finished her own cup. Now he sat, and sometimes he talked about what the day held, and sometimes she answered with something practical about what she intended, and sometimes neither of them said anything at all, and the kitchen held them both without difficulty. It was the kind of quiet that 2 people only fall into together when they have stopped working at it, and neither of them remarked on it, because remarking on it would have been the fastest way to end it. The children came every morning now. Their mother, a compact and watchful woman named Mrs. Farrow, had appeared at the fence line 3 times, always with something left on the post. A jar of something preserved, a folded cloth, once a small bundle of dried sage that smelled like the open land after rain. She never stayed. She always looked at Wren for a moment before she left with the expression of a woman revising an earlier opinion. The lessons had moved from the table in the side yard to the covered end of the porch, which was warmer in the mornings and had the additional advantage of a low railing the children could lean against when they wanted to think. Wren had found a piece of flat board in the barn that served as a writing surface, and she had located chalk in a tin at the back of the kitchen shelf, and with these things she had assembled something that resembled, if you were willing to use your imagination, a schoolroom. It was on a morning when the lesson had run long, and Ruth had fallen asleep against the porch post with her slate pencil still in her hand, that Cord came around the corner of the house and stopped. He had been mending the corral gate. She had heard the hammer going intermittently since breakfast, and he still had a nail between his fingers and sawdust across one shoulder. He looked at the sleeping child, then at Eli and Nessa, who were bent over the board working through a problem she had set them, then at Wren, who was watching Ruth sleep with an expression she hadn't arranged for an audience. He stood there long enough that Nessa looked up and saw him and said, with perfect unself-consciousness, "Mr. Mallory, do you know what a syllable is?" Cord looked at her. "I might," he said cautiously. "Miss Wren says every word has a beat in it, like a heartbeat. And if you listen for the beats, you can break the word into pieces, and the pieces are easier." Nessa demonstrated by tapping her finger on the board. Syllable. 3 beats. Cord looked at Ren. She's correct, Ren said. He looked at Nessa again. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Brief, involuntary, the kind of expression a face makes before the rest of the person can catch up to it. Then he said, "Good to know," and went back around the corner of the house. And the hammer started up again a moment later. That evening, after supper, she was washing the dishes when she heard him come into the kitchen behind her and stop. She did not turn around. She had learned that Cord moved toward things in stages, the way a cautious person approaches open ground. Slowly, with pauses to make sure it was safe to keep going. And that turning to face him too quickly was the conversational equivalent of moving too fast. "The Pharaoh girls," he said. "Their father passed 2 winters back." She kept her hands in the wash basin. "I didn't know that. Their mother's been running their place alone since." A pause. She brought preserves again, left them on the fence. "I'll use them for the week's baking." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "She didn't used to come near this property." He said it without inflection, as a statement of fact, but the fact had weight to it. Nobody much did. After. He stopped, and she heard the small sound of a man who has said something true and is now reckoning with it. "It's different now." Ren turned from the basin. He was standing near the table with his arms crossed, the way a man stands when he's been holding himself together for so long that the position has become default. He was looking somewhere past her left shoulder, out the window, at the dark that had settled over the yard. "Things change when people stop being afraid," she said. He brought his gaze to her then. Direct, level. "Were they afraid of me? Of what they didn't understand?" she said. "It's usually the same thing." He looked at her for a moment. Then he unfolded his arms and pulled out a chair and sat down, which was not something he usually did after supper. She finished the dishes and dried her hands and sat across from him, because it seemed like he had something and was deciding whether to hand it over. He told her now. Not all at once. It came in pieces, the way these things come, with long stretches of silence between that she did not try to fill. He told her about the weeks after, when he had not been able to go into certain rooms, about the cradle he had built with his own hands in the months before, and how after he had covered it and been unable to move it. About Beckett Vane arriving at his door the week after the funeral with a grief that had already, even then, sharpened itself into something closer to accusation. About the way Cord had absorbed it without defending himself, partly because he was too broken to argue, and partly because some piece of him had decided that if Vane needed someone to hold responsible, and Cord was the person available, then perhaps that was something he could at least provide. "That was wrong of you," Ren said, when the silence had held long enough. He looked at her with something that might have been surprise if surprise hadn't been so far from where he was. "What? To let him do that? To decide that because you were grieving, you deserved to be blamed?" He was quiet for a moment. "It wasn't that simple. I know it wasn't," she said. "Grief never is. But there's a difference between carrying loss and letting someone build a case against you with it." She held his gaze. "You know the difference." "You talk like someone who's been on the wrong end of it," he said. "Not an accusation, an observation." She had been waiting for this, not the moment exactly, but the arrival of the conversation that would require it. She told him about the school, about the man who had run it, and the scholarship fund, and the way the money had been disappearing in amounts small enough not to raise immediate alarm but large enough, over time, to matter. She told him how she had noticed it and what she had done about it. Going to the school board, making the case with the ledger in her hands, believing, as she had always believed, that the truth was its own protection. She told him how badly she had been wrong about that. She did not dramatize it. She gave it to him the way she would have given it to anyone she trusted with it, plainly, in order, without editorializing on her own pain, because she was not a woman who put her pain out in the center of a room. She kept it at the edges, where it could be acknowledged without becoming the entire conversation. They believed him, she said. The board, the parents, people who had known me for years, because he had been there longer, and because it is always easier to believe the person you have already decided is reliable. She looked at the table. I was asked to leave the building before I had collected my things. 3 people walked me to the door. She paused. Not to be kind, to make sure I went. The kitchen was very quiet. The book, Cord said after a moment. She looked up. The one you carry everywhere, he said. That's from the school. It was mine, she said. I bought it myself, which was the only reason I had grounds to take it when I left. A pause. I took it because I wanted to remember what it felt like to do the work correctly. Before. She stopped. It helps. He looked at her across the table with the full attention of a man who had been listening to something that had cost the speaker something to say. He did not rush to fill the space with reassurance or sympathy. He simply received it, the way a good listener receives things, fully, without immediately trying to fix it. We're a pair, he said quietly, and there was nothing ironic in it. Just the plain recognition of 2 people who had been carrying similar shapes of damage in entirely different containers. Wren looked at him, and for a moment the careful management she maintained over her own expression slipped just slightly, enough to let something real come through. Not tears, but something honest and unguarded and not entirely comfortable, which was as close to vulnerable as she generally allowed herself in company. Yes, she said, we are. After that, something in the house changed again. Another degree, another fraction. Not dramatic. More like the slow change of season, where the evidence accumulates so gradually that you can never say exactly when it turned, only that at some point, you look up and everything is different from what it was. He started talking more at breakfast. Real things, not just the logistics of the day. He told her about the land, its history, the way it had come to his family, the particular quality of the east pasture in the early light when the grass was long. She, in turn, began to tell him smaller things, the way Eli had finally unlocked the concept of the silent letter and had said with a satisfaction so complete it was almost physical, "So the letter is there, but it doesn't speak. It just holds space." The way Ruth had solemnly informed her that the word beautiful was the most complicated word she had ever heard, and she intended to use it as much as possible to make the difficulty worthwhile. He listened to these things with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, complete, unhurried. Sometimes something moved at the corner of his mouth. He never quite let it become a full expression, but she had learned to watch for it the way you learn to watch for weather signs on open land. It was on a late afternoon, 10 days or so into the rhythm they had found, that she heard him come in from the front of the house and stop. She came through the kitchen doorway and found him standing in front of the corner where the cradle was. He had the white cloth in his hands. He was standing with it folded against his chest, and he was looking at the cradle, which was small and pale in the dimming afternoon light, its curved base resting on the floor like something that had been holding its breath for a very long time. She stopped in the doorway. He did not look at her. He knew she was there. She was certain of that. But he kept his eyes on the cradle, and she stayed where she was and let him have the moment however he needed it. After a very long time, he said, without turning, "I made it the month before she was due." His voice was low and careful. "Took me 2 weeks. I'd never made furniture before. I looked up how to do it, and then I did it wrong several times before I did it right." A pause. She laughed at the first attempt, said it looked like something a horse had sat on. Another pause, and in it, something that happened in the chest rather than the throat. She had a good laugh. Wren stayed in the doorway. She did not move toward him, and she did not move away. She simply remained and let him know she was remaining. "I couldn't move it," he said. "After. I thought if I moved it, it would mean..." He stopped. His jaw worked slightly. "I don't know what I thought. I stopped thinking clearly for a long time." "That's allowed," Wren said quietly. He was quiet for another moment. Then he looked at the cloth in his hands. "I want to move it," he said. And the word "want" had in it the sound of something that had been locked up for a long time and was testing the lock. "I think I want to move it." She crossed the room then, not quickly, and came to stand beside him, not touching, not crowding, just near. She looked at the cradle with him. It was well made. The joints clean, the curves even, the wood sanded smooth. 2 weeks of a man teaching himself something new because there was someone coming who would need it. "Where would you put it?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "The back room," he said. "There's space, and it doesn't need to be hidden. It's a good piece of work." He said this last part with the slight awkwardness of someone giving themselves permission for something they have been withholding. "It is," she said honestly, "because it was." He nodded once, and then, in a gesture so small and so deliberate that it held more weight than almost anything she had witnessed him do, he reached up with his left hand and looked at the ring on his 4th finger. He did not take it off. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man conducting a private and serious reckoning, and then he lowered his hand and was still. "I don't want to pretend she didn't exist," he said. "I don't want to cover that over." "No one's asking you to," Wren said. He looked at her then, and she met his look steadily, without demand or expectation, because what was in his eyes was not yet anything that had resolved itself into a simple thing, and it would not be honest to treat it as if it had. "Burying something isn't the same as honoring it," she said. "You can keep her real without keeping everything the way it was the day she left." He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his face shifted, not a break, not a collapse, but a loosening, the way very tight rope goes when the tension is finally, correctly, relieved. "You're easier to talk to than I expected," he said. "You're harder to talk to than you think you are," she said, "but you're worth the effort." He turned back to the cradle and bent down and picked it up, carefully, the way he handled anything that required handling with care, and he carried it down the hall to the back room, and she heard him set it down, and then there was quiet. When he came back through, his hands were empty and his face was the same as always. Steady, unreadable at the surface, whatever was underneath it already back in its private place. But something in the set of his shoulders was different, slightly lower, not defeated, released. He went to the kitchen and put the kettle on without being asked. She sat at the table and opened the book to the page she had been working through with the children that morning, and she read it in the lamplight while he made the tea. And outside, the wind moved through the yard with its customary indifference to everything human, and inside the kitchen smelled of fire and old wood and the sage from Mrs. Farrow's last bundle, which she had tied above the window. It smelled like a place that someone was living in again. She did not look up when he set the cup in front of her. She said, "Thank you," without making it into more than that. He sat down across from her with his own cup and looked at the window, and she looked at the book, and neither of them said anything for a long time. It was, she thought, without quite letting herself think it all the way. It was something like being home. The notice arrived on a Tuesday. Wren was at the porch with the children when the writer came through the gate. A young man she did not recognize, with the look of someone performing an errand he had been paid to complete and wanted to complete quickly. He did not dismount. He held out a folded paper and said Cord Mallory's name, and Cord, who had come around from the barn at the sound of the hooves, took it without a word. The rider turned and left at the same pace he had arrived. The children looked at the paper, then at Cord, then at Wren, with the instinctive awareness children have for the weather of adult faces. "Go on ahead with the reading," Wren said evenly. "The page we left off at." They went back to it with the slightly exaggerated attention of children who are listening with one ear to something other than the lesson. Wren stepped off the porch and crossed the yard to where Cord was standing. He had unfolded the notice and read it once. He was reading it again with the particular stillness of a man confirming that what he thought he saw is in fact what is there. He handed it to her without speaking. She read it carefully, parsing the formal language that had been used to dress up a simple and brutal fact. The language of such documents was always this way: careful, structured, impersonal, as if the wrapping could neutralize the contents. It could not. What the notice said, once the wrapping was removed, was that a debt from the time of Cord's father, originally held by a creditor now deceased, had been acquired by a third party. That third party was exercising its rights under the original terms. Full payment was required within 72 hours. In the event of non-payment, seizure of the property designated as collateral, Duskwater Ranch, all structures and land, would commence immediately. The third party was not named in the document. She did not need it named. "Can you pay it?" she asked, though she already knew. She knew the ranch's finances well enough by now. "No," he said, flat. Simple. She folded the notice and handed it back. 72 hours was not an accident of timing. Nothing about this was accidental. It was constructed, built from parts gathered and arranged over time with the patience of a man who had learned that the most effective pressure arrives looking like legitimate process. "He bought the debt," she said. "Had to have been sitting on it a while," Cord said, waiting for the right time to call it. The right time was now. When Cord had begun, barely, tentatively, in the small and private ways she had been watching, to come back. When the house smelled like something again, and there were children on the porch, and a woman at the table who had given him a reason to consider the future. When the long, patient project of making Cord Mallory into a man who would eventually stop fighting had been interrupted, his face had closed in the way she had not seen it be for a week and a half. Something locked back down behind the steadiness that was his default response to pain. He was looking at the gate with the expression of a man who has believed, privately, that this was always coming. "Don't," she said. He looked at her. Don't decide it's over, she said. Not yet. He held her gaze. Then he looked back at the gate. He's had that debt for God knows how long. He chose this moment to call it. That's not something I can fight in 72 hours. You don't know what you can fight, she said, until you try. She let the silence have its moment and then said, There are things I need to tell you. Things I've been holding until the time was right. And the time is right now. She looked at the porch where the children were bent over their work. Tonight, after they've gone, he nodded once. When they had gone, and the yard was quiet, and the supper had been eaten and the dishes done, she sat down across from Cord at the table and told him. She told him about the doctor, about the visit she had made under the pretense of liniment, and what old Haber had said without being asked, and what he had kept. She told it plainly, without ornament, watching Cord's face as the information landed, first with the careful blankness of a man who is not ready to believe something, and then with something harder to look at, which was the face of someone beginning to believe it against their own long resistance. She told him the record existed, that it documented the night precisely, that it placed Cord at the doctor's office before there was certain cause for alarm, and recorded the nature of the complication in terms that were unambiguous. That Haber had kept it because it was accurate, and had been silent for 3 years, because Beckett Vane was a man whose shadow fell over a great deal of what the town needed to function. And Haber was an old man who had run out of courage before he ran out of knowledge. Cord was very still through all of this. His hands were on the table, not moving. His eyes were on her. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet for a long time. He knew, Cord said finally. The words came out without inflection, which meant they were carrying more than she could hear in the surface of them. He knew from the beginning, she said. Haber told him. Vane chose his own version. Cord's jaw moved. Something shifted in his face, a tightening, deep and slow, like the earth shifting beneath a foundation. 3 years, he said. Yes. He stood in this yard and told me I had failed her, and he had already been told that wasn't true. And he stopped. He let me carry it. Yes, Wren said, and did not soften it, because it didn't deserve to be softened. The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind they had been building. It was the silence of something enormous being reckoned with, and she sat in it with him and did not try to move him through it faster than it could be moved through. After a long time, he said, Why didn't Haber come forward? Fear, she said. Vane holds too much in that town. Haber is old and knows what it means to be on the wrong side of a man with that kind of reach. She paused. He said he was tired of being tired of it. He'll stand by the record. He already sent word to Maren Holst on the council. Cord looked at her. You went and found all this. I went and listened, she said. People needed someone to tell it to. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, with a quietness that had something raw in it, Why? She understood the question. Not why had she gone to Haber, but why had she done any of it? The looking, the listening, the careful gathering of what was real. Why she had stayed after the empty basket and the closed doors and Vane's visit and the notice that had come that morning. Because what's being done to you is wrong, she said. And I know what it looks like when something wrong is being dressed up as inevitable. I've stood on that side of it. She did not look away from him. I also know that it isn't inevitable. It only feels that way when you've been standing inside it alone long enough. He looked at her across the table, and something in his face changed in a way she had not seen before. Not the small, involuntary movements she had been learning to read, but something larger and more deliberate, as if he had made a decision about something and was letting it show. He reached up with his left hand. He looked at the ring on his fourth finger, plain, worn, daily. And then, with the slow and considered motion of a man doing something real rather than symbolic, he slid it off. He held it in his palm for a moment, looking at it. Then he placed it on the table between them, gently, and left it there. "I've been wearing it because I thought taking it off meant I was leaving her behind," he said. "Like the cradle. Like everything I haven't been able to move." He looked at the ring on the table. "But I'm starting to think that leaving things exactly as they were isn't the same as honoring them. It's just stopping the clock." "Yes," she said quietly. He looked at her. "You told me that before. I wasn't ready to hear it." "You heard it when you were ready," she said. "That's how it works." He nodded, a slow single movement. Then he curled his fingers around the ring and held it, not putting it back on, not putting it away, just holding it. Not at the end of something, and not at the beginning of something else, but in the space between, which was the hardest place to stand, and the only honest one. She was still looking at him when, from somewhere outside, she heard hoofbeats, more than one horse, moving fast, from the direction of town. Cord heard it too. His head came up. They looked at each other for a brief moment, the kind of look that passes between two people who have become, without quite negotiating it, the kind of unit that faces things together. And then he rose and went to the window. "Vane," he said. She came and stood beside him. 3 horses in the yard, Vane on the gray, and 2 men flanking him, broader than the watchful young man from his previous visit. Men who had been brought for a purpose other than appearance. They went out onto the porch. The night air was cold and sharp, carrying the smell of the open land and something faintly like coming weather. The lantern by the front door threw unsteady light across the yard. Vane sat his horse with the ease of a man who believed the ground beneath him was his regardless of whose name was on it. He looked at Wren and Cord standing together on the porch, and something moved in his face. Brief, quickly managed, but she saw it. Calculation. And beneath that, the particular anger of a man who has arranged things carefully and is watching them come apart. "Cord," he said pleasantly, "I imagine you received the notice today." "I did," Cord said. "I wanted to come by personally," Vane said, "to make sure there was no confusion about the terms." He glanced at Wren. "I also thought it might be the courteous thing to let your guest understand the situation clearly." "Miss Calloway understands the situation clearly," Cord said. His voice was level and quiet, and it had something in it she had not heard before. Not louder than usual, but denser, as if something had been added to it. "Better than you probably hoped." Vane's pleasant expression did not move. "I hope you're not making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "The terms are legal. This doesn't have to be unpleasant." "No," Cord said. "It doesn't." He stepped off the porch and crossed the yard to stand below where Vane sat on the horse, and the lamplight fell across his face in a way that made visible what was in it. Something very different from the hollow endurance that had characterized the 3 years prior. "Haber's records exist," he said. "All of them. You know that, because he told you what was in them the week after Eileen died, and you chose not to accept it. And you've been operating on your own version of events for 3 years. He paused. That version is not going to hold anymore. The first crack in Vane's expression was small. A slight compression at the corners of his mouth, a flicker in the eyes, quickly covered. But she saw it, and she thought Cord saw it too. Whatever Haber has told you, Vane said, the warmth going out of his voice like a fire when the wood is running out, is the account of an old man. He was the only doctor in that room, Cord said. And what he recorded is what happened, and it doesn't match the story you've been telling. He held Vane's gaze without difficulty. I'm not asking you to forgive me. There's nothing to forgive. But what you've been doing to this land and to this household is over. Vane was quiet for a moment. Then, the pleasantness gone entirely. The debt is still real. I know, Cord said. I'll deal with it. You can't pay it. There are other ways to deal with things, Cord said. You've been using them for years. Another silence. Wren stood on the porch and watched Beckett Vane do something she had seen before. The precise moment when a man who has built his power on the certainty that others will back down faces the first real indication that this time they will not. He gathered his reins. We'll see, he said, which was not what he had come here to say, and both of them knew it. He rode out, the two men following, and the yard settled back into its evening sounds. Cord stood where he was for a moment after the hoofbeats faded. Then he turned back toward the porch. He'll come back with something else, she said. Yes, we need Haber to stand up publicly, not just to us. I know. He came back to the porch steps and stopped, looking up at her. You said we, he said. She looked at him. I did. He stood for a moment on the step below her, the night air moving between them, cold and carrying the distant smell of weather. His left hand was at his side, the ring finger bare for the first time in 3 years. I need to tell you something, he said, before we go any further with any of this. He said it with the gravity of a man who has decided to be honest and is making sure the decision holds. I didn't come to meet you at the station because I was afraid. She waited. Not afraid of you, he said. Afraid of what it would mean. If I started something. If I let someone arrive. Into this. He gestured slightly, meaning the house, the land, the whole arrangement of a life he had stopped expecting to grow. I thought if I didn't meet the train, you'd leave on the next one and I'd be back to the only thing I knew how to manage. And instead I walked 4 miles in the dark, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Instead, you walked 4 miles in the dark, he said, and started a fire in my kitchen before I was awake. Your kindling was right there, she said. I know. He looked at her directly, with the fullness of attention that was simply how he was, when he had decided something mattered. I'm glad you came, he said. I'm glad you stayed. And I'm sorry I wasn't at the station. She looked at him for a moment. At this man who had been hollowed out by grief, and then by 3 years of being told that grief was justice, who had covered a cradle and stopped the clocks and held on to a ring that represented something real and refused to let it go until he finally, slowly, began to understand that holding on and honoring were not always the same thing. You're forgiven, she said, simply, without conditions. Now come inside. It's cold. He came inside. She went to the table where his ring was still sitting in the middle of it, and she picked it up and held it for a moment, and then she went to the shelf above the fireplace and set it there, carefully, upright, where it could be seen. Not hidden, not discarded, placed. He watched her do it. When she turned from the shelf, he was standing in the middle of the room, looking at the ring where it now rested, and the expression on his face was not easy to look at. But she looked at it anyway, because it was real and because he deserved to have it witnessed. "That's where it belongs," she said. "Not gone, just not in the way of what comes next." He nodded slowly. Then he looked at her, and the expression on his face resolved into something quieter and more settled. "We have work to do tomorrow," he said. "We do," she agreed. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, and he sat at the table, and outside the weather that had been threatening all evening began to arrive in the form of wind against the windows and the first distant sound of rain. Inside, the fire was going, and the ring was on the shelf, and the book was on the table where she had left it, and the morning was going to come with everything it was going to come with. But the morning was the morning. Tonight was this. The morning came gray and purposeful, the rain from the night before, leaving the yard dark and softened underfoot, the air carrying that particular clean weight that follows a long rain in an open land. Wren was up before first light, as she always was, but she did not start breakfast immediately. She sat at the table with the book in front of her and did not open it. She was thinking. She laid out what she knew the way she used to lay out a lesson plan, not by feeling but by structure, working from what was certain toward what was possible. What was certain, the debt was real, the timeline was real. 72 hours was now closer to 48, and Beckett Vane was not a man who made idle gestures. What was possible? Haber had records. Haber had said he would stand by them, and Marin Holst on the council had already been told. 3 years of a man being quietly wronged by someone with power was the kind of story that, told correctly to the right people, could shift the ground beneath everyone standing on it. Cord came out of the hallway and into the kitchen without seeming surprised to find her already there. He looked at the unlit stove, then at her. "We should go into town early," she said. "I was thinking the same." She got up and started the stove. They rode out while the light was still coming in low and pale from the east, the land on either side of the road wet and steaming slightly where the morning warmth was beginning to work against the night's rain. There was a quality to the silence between them now that was different from the early silences, not empty, but occupied, the way a room is occupied by people who are thinking in the same direction. Haber was already in his office when they arrived, which suggested he had not slept well or had been expecting them. He looked at them both over the rims of his glasses with the expression of a man who has made a decision in the small hours and is committed to it in the daylight, which is always the harder test. "I'll write a statement," he said, before either of them spoke. "Whatever form you need it in. I'll sign it and I'll read it aloud if it comes to that." He paused, and the pause had something old and heavy in it. "It should have been done 3 years ago." Cord looked at the doctor for a long moment with an expression that was not anger. It was closer to sorrow, the particular kind that arrives not at the original loss but at the discovery of how much extra weight had been added to it unnecessarily by someone else's choice. "I don't blame you," Cord said finally. Haber looked at him. "You might consider it," he said. "It would be fair, maybe," Cord said, "but it won't help." The old doctor reached into the drawer of his desk and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its cover worn at the corners from years of use. He opened it to a page marked with a folded strip of paper and laid it flat on the desk, turning it so they could read it. The handwriting was careful and precise, the entries detailed in the language of a man recording what he observed, rather than what he felt about observing it. She read it. Then she looked at Cord, who was reading it, and she watched the moment arrive on his face, the moment of seeing in plain written language what had actually happened, set down by a witness with no stake in the outcome other than accuracy. His jaw tightened once. His hand, which had been resting on the desk, went still. Then something in his face moved through and past the tightening into something quieter and more fundamental. Not relief exactly. Something beneath relief. The ground becoming solid again under a man who had been standing on uncertain footing for a very long time. He did not say anything. He did not need to. They were leaving Haber's office when the trouble found them. Not Vane himself. She had expected Vane, had been watching for the gray horse and the silver hair. Instead, it was something she had not anticipated, which was always the kind that landed hardest. The man was standing at the edge of the main street, outside the grain and feed, and she almost did not recognize him because she had not seen him in over a year and because people look different when they are out of their context. But she recognized him. The thinning hair, the careful posture of a man who had spent decades presenting himself as more substantial than he was. The headmaster of the school where she had taught. The man who had taken the ledger from her hands and turned it into evidence against her. His name was Aldous Price, and he was standing on the main street of Harrow Creek looking directly at her. For a moment, the world had the slightly unreal quality of a thing encountered in the wrong place. A page from one book appearing in the middle of another. Then the moment passed, and she understood with cold clarity. He was not here by coincidence. There was no version of Aldous Price appearing in this particular town at this particular moment that did not have Beckett Vane's name somewhere upstream of it. Cord had seen her face change. He followed her gaze. "Who is that?" he said. "The man who had me removed from the school," she said quietly. Her voice was even. The moment of shock passed. What replaced it was cooler and steadier and more useful. Price crossed the street toward them with the careful dignity of a man who has rehearsed this. He looked at Wren with an expression he had probably been working on, concerned, reluctant, the face of someone compelled by unfortunate circumstances to perform an unpleasant duty. "Miss Calloway," he said, "I'd hoped not to have to come so far." "And yet here you are," she said. He glanced at Cord with the assessing look of someone measuring an audience. "I've been asked to come forward with information relevant to a character matter," he said, "regarding someone who has recently arrived in this community." He paused with the timing of a man who knows how to use pauses. "It would have been irresponsible not to." "Asked by whom?" Cord said. Price looked at him. "That's not relevant to the substance of the concern. It's relevant to everything," Cord said, with the flat directness that she had come to understand was his most dangerous register, because it contained no warning and no performance. It was simply a man saying the true thing. Price shifted slightly. He had prepared for Wren, she could see that. He had not fully prepared for the man beside her. Miss Calloway was dismissed from her position under circumstances that included allegations of financial impropriety, Price said, returning to his prepared speech. The school board reviewed the matter and determined there was sufficient evidence to... The school board, Wren said, reviewed a version of events that you constructed after I brought you evidence of your own financial impropriety. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The money that went missing from the scholarship fund was traceable. I showed you the ledger. You took it from my hands, and 2 days later, you showed the board a different version of the same ledger and told them I had been falsifying it. Price's prepared expression did not leave his face, but something behind it changed. That is an extremely serious allegation. It is, she said. And I made it then, and I'm making it now. The difference is that then I was making it alone, and I didn't know yet that being alone was what you were counting on. Cord had not moved. He was standing beside her in the way he had a habit of standing when something was happening. Not in front of her, not behind, but parallel. The physical language of a man who did not believe in blocking a person from their own fight, but did not intend to leave them to conduct it without backup. People on the street had begun to slow, attending with the sideways attention of people who are trying to watch something while appearing not to watch it. I think, said a voice behind them, that this is a conversation the council ought to hear. She turned. The woman who had spoken was perhaps 60, with a direct gaze and the kind of face that had settled into its final form some years back, and was entirely comfortable there. Maren Holst, Cord said quietly beside her. She's on the town council. Holst was looking at Price. I've been told Mr. Vane brought you out here to speak to the council about Miss Calloway's background, she said. I've also been told this morning some things that seem relevant to the context. Haber came to see me before his office opened. She paused. I think you'd all better come inside. The council chamber was a single room above the land office, with 4 chairs behind a long table and a row of plain chairs facing it. 2 other council members were already present when they arrived, which told her that Holst had called them early. Price sat on one side. Wren and Cord sat on the other. Haber came in shortly after, carrying his journal, and took a seat to the side. What followed was not a trial. It was something more ordinary and more difficult, a conversation in which people with different accounts of the same events were required to give those accounts in a room where the difference between them would be visible to people paying attention. Price gave his account first. It was polished and coherent, and rested almost entirely on the board's decision rather than on the underlying facts. He cited the process rather than the evidence, which was the move of a man who knew the evidence did not fully support the conclusion he was defending. Then Wren gave hers. She had told this story before, to herself, in the long months after, working through it, trying to understand where it had gone wrong. But she had not told it to people with authority to hear it, and the willingness to listen. And there was a quality to speaking true things in a room with actual listeners that was different from speaking them into the silence of a room alone. She kept to facts. She kept to sequence. She did not editorialize, and she did not perform. She had learned from years in a classroom that the most powerful thing a person could do when telling something true was to trust the truth to carry its own weight. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. One of the council members, a man with a gray beard who had not spoken yet, looked at Price. Do you have documentation of the board's findings that you can share with this body? Price said he did not have it with him. Did you bring any documentation at all? The man asked. Price said he had been brought here on short notice and had understood his role to be providing testimony. By Beckett Vane, Holst said, not a question. Price did not answer. The silence of his non-answer said what any answer would have said. Haber read his statement then, slowly, precisely, in the careful voice of a man reading something he had written and rewritten in his mind for 3 years. He read the details and the clinical descriptions, and he read the conclusion, which was clear and unambiguous. And when he was finished, he placed the journal on the table and folded his hands and waited. The gray-bearded council member looked at Cord. You've known about this record? I found out yesterday, Cord said. And the debt notice? Yesterday as well. The man looked at his hands for a moment, doing the arithmetic. Not the arithmetic of the legal situation, which was complex, but the human arithmetic of what had been done here and over what period and by whom. It was not a fast calculation. When he raised his head, his expression had a quality she recognized from the faces of people who have arrived at a conclusion they did not entirely want to arrive at. "I think," he said, "that we need to have a conversation about Mr. Vane's interests in this matter that does not include any of his intermediaries." He looked at Holst. She gave a single nod. Wren and Cord were asked to wait outside. They sat on a bench in the hallway with the muffled sound of voices through the door. Then Cord said, "You knew he'd be here, Price. I suspected Vane would send something," she said. "I didn't know it would be him specifically. Vane would have asked who in her past had something to gain from her discreditation." She paused. "Price has always had something to gain." Cord was quiet for a moment. "How long did you carry that?" he said. "What they did to you. How long before you could talk about it the way you just talked about it in there?" She considered the question honestly. "A long time," she said. "I was angry for a long time first. Not the loud kind. The kind that sits in your chest and makes everything taste slightly wrong." She looked at her hands. "I'm not angry anymore. Mostly." "What changed?" She thought about it. "I stopped being alone in it," she said. "That changes the weight of things." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the door. "We'll see what they decide." "Yes," she said. The door opened 40 minutes later. Holst stood in the frame with the expression of someone who has arrived at a decision that is clear and who is still carrying the weight of how much should have been clearer much sooner. "Come back in," she said. What they were told, the debt would be reviewed for the circumstances of its acquisition, which Holst said she had reason to believe had involved practices inconsistent with the council's standards. Pending that review, enforcement proceedings were suspended. Furthermore, the council intended to formally require that Beckett Vane appear before them to address several matters that had come to their attention, Haber's record among them, but not exclusively. Price had already left the building. Wren and Cord came out onto the main street in the mid-morning light, and the town went on around them as it always did. Ordinary, unhurried, indifferent to what had just happened in the room above the land office. That was always the way of it. The world did not stop to mark the moments when things shifted. It just kept going, and you kept going with it, carrying whatever had changed inside you like something newly placed rather than newly acquired. She stopped on the boardwalk. He stopped beside her. "It's not over," she said. "No," he agreed. "Vane won't sit quietly. He'll come to the council," she said. "He'll make his case. He has resources and he has debts people owe him, and some of that will hold even now." "Some of it," Cord said. "Not all of it." He looked at her. "You stood in there and told a room full of people what was done to you. You didn't flinch." "I was angry the first time," she said. "I was alone the first time." She met his gaze. This time was different. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, with the plain directness that was his version of tenderness, "Come home." 2 words, but they landed with the full weight of everything that word had been building toward for weeks. The kitchen, the candle, the children on the porch, the ring on the shelf, the cradle moved to a room where it could be a memory rather than a wound. Home. She had not let herself call it that yet. had kept the word at arm's length the way she kept a lot of things she wanted, giving herself only the edges of them until she was certain the ground beneath was real. She looked at him. Then she looked down the street in the direction of the road that led back to Duskwater, 4 miles through open land, wet from the night's rain and lit now by the full morning, and the book was under her arm where it always was, and there was work still to be done. "All right," she said. They rode back in the late morning light, and before they reached the halfway point, before the familiar fence line of Duskwater came into view, Cord reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the folded paper, the ticket she had purchased that morning at the post-writer's counter before they left, before the council chamber, before any of it. He held it out to her without speaking. She had not thought he had noticed. She had purchased it quietly, tucked it into her coat, told herself it was practical, that a woman in her situation needed options, needed to know there was a way out if the ground gave. She had told herself it was not defeat to keep a door unlocked behind her. He had seen it. Of course he had. Cord Mallory noticed everything he appeared not to notice. She looked at the ticket in his hand. The paper was crisp and official, printed with the name of the next station east, the place she had started from, or near enough to it that the difference hardly mattered. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she took it from his hand, and without ceremony, without speeches, she tore it in half, then in half again. She let the pieces fall from her fingers, and the wind that moved across the open land took them, tumbling them away into the tall grass at the side of the road until they disappeared. Cord watched them go. Then he looked at her. "I want to stay," she said simply, not because she had to, not because there was nowhere else. "I want to be here. That's different from before." He held her gaze with that particular quality of attention he reserved for things that mattered, complete, unhurried, taking in everything she was saying and everything she was not saying, and making no move to rush past any of it. Then he gave one slow nod, the kind that meant the decision had been received and was being kept. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was the right kind of silence. The kind that has been filled rather than emptied, the kind that two people share when they have each said what needed to be said and found, to their quiet relief, that it was enough. Duskwater came into view over the last rise, and it looked exactly as it always did, low and solid and a little worn at the edges, the fence line running long in both directions, the barn roof clean against the sky, the covered porch where 3 small chairs still sat in the configuration of a schoolroom, her fire cold in the kitchen, his tools where he had left them by the barn door, the ring on the shelf above the fireplace, placed and visible, belonging where it was. She took in the whole of it from horseback as they came through the gate, and felt something she had been careful not to call by its real name until now settle quietly and completely into place. It was home. It had been home for some time. She had simply needed to choose it openly, with both hands, instead of holding it at arm's length against the possibility of loss. Loss was coming regardless. It always did, for everyone, sooner or later. The question was never whether you could prevent it. The question was whether, while you had the time, you had the courage to be fully present for the good of it. She dismounted and led her horse to the rail and went inside. The weeks that followed had the quality of something being built. Not loudly, not with any great declaration, but steadily. The way a fence gets put in, one post at a time, until one day you look up and there is something solid where before there was only open ground. Vane appeared before the council, as predicted, and made his case with the full weight of his resources and his years of accumulated influence. Some of it held, not all of it. Holst asked questions he could not answer cleanly. The gray-bearded council member produced an independent reading of the debt's acquisition that raised questions Vane's lawyer had to work hard to address. Haber sat in the front row and did not look away when Vane looked at him. It was not quick. It was not clean. But it moved in the direction of truth, which was the only direction Wren had ever known how to aim. The debt was ultimately settled on terms different from what Vane had demanded. The council's review had found enough irregularities in the acquisition to require renegotiation, and the creditor's estate, once properly engaged, had no interest in the particular outcome Vane had engineered. Cord paid what was actually owed, which was considerably less than what had been threatened, and the land remained his. Vane withdrew from Harrow Creek by degrees, which was how men of his kind left things, not in defeat, not in acknowledgement, but in a gradual reduction of presence that allowed them to tell themselves they had simply moved on to other concerns. He was still there, at the edges of things, and Wren understood he would always be there at some distance. But the shape of his power had changed. He had been seen, which was the thing men like him could least afford. The children kept coming. By the time the first frost settled over the valley, Eli could read anything she put in front of him and had developed the particular confidence of a reader who has discovered that books are not obstacles, but doors. Nessa had begun to help Ruth with her letters in the mornings before the lesson started, with the solemn authority of a 7-year-old who has just discovered the pleasure of knowing something worth teaching. Ruth herself had made good on her promise regarding the word beautiful, which appeared in her exercises with a frequency that was impressive and slightly exhausting. Mrs. Farrow had stopped leaving things at the fence post and started staying for coffee. Cora Hutchins from the Mercantile had sent a basket unannounced with a note that said only we were wrong about you, which was more than Wren had expected and exactly what she had needed. And Cord had changed in the way of things that change because they were always capable of it and simply needed the right conditions. He still did not use sentences when phrases would do, and he still moved through the world with the particular quietness of a man who had spent years learning that stillness was a form of survival. But the stillness was different now, less like held breath, more like the stillness of open land in the early morning, spacious rather than contained, at rest rather than bracing. He laughed sometimes in the evenings, not often, but the sound of it, when it came, had the quality of something long unused and unexpectedly restored to working order. The ring stayed on the shelf above the fireplace. Neither of them had spoken about moving it. It did not need to be moved. It was where it belonged, not hidden, not discarded, not pretending to be something other than what it was, which was evidence of a life that had been real and mattered and left its mark on a man worth knowing. Wren passed it every morning and every evening and had made a private peace with its presence, the same peace she had made with all the things that could not be changed and did not need to be erased. Cord had ridden out to speak to the council directly on a morning 2 weeks after the formal proceedings had concluded, not because he was required to, but because he believed in finishing things properly. She had watched him saddle his horse and ride toward town with the particular purposefulness of a man who has spent a long time allowing circumstances to be done to him and has decided, finally, that doing things himself is the better arrangement. He came back in the late afternoon with the quiet, settled expression of someone who has put something down that they had been carrying for a long time in the wrong position. He did not say much about what had been said. He did not need to. She had learned to read the shape of what he carried in the set of his shoulders and the way he moved through the yard. And what she read that evening was something she had not seen before. A lightness, not dramatic, not the sudden buoyancy of a man who has been saved, but the steady, sustainable kind that comes from a weight being properly resolved rather than merely set aside. He unsaddled the horse, brushed her down, let her loose in the pasture, and came inside. He washed his hands at the basin. He sat down at the table. And he looked at Wren with the full attention he reserved for things that mattered and said simply, "It's settled." "All of it?" she asked. "Enough of it," he said. "The rest will settle on its own." He looked at the table for a moment. "Holst told me something about why Vane did it the way he did." He paused, turning the coffee cup in his hands. She said he came to her, privately, after the formal proceedings, not to fight the outcome, just to... He stopped. "He said he knew, all along, that it wasn't my fault, that Haber told him the truth that week, and he knew it was the truth." He was quiet for a moment. He said he couldn't accept it because accepting it meant there was no one to blame, and without someone to blame, there was just Eileen, gone, and the child, gone, for no reason anyone could point to or fight or punish. His voice did not break, but it thinned the way very strong things thin under very precise pressure. He needed it to be someone's fault because otherwise it was just the way of things, and he couldn't live with that. Wren sat very still. "I understand that," Cord said after a long pause. "I don't forgive what he did, but I understand it." He set the coffee cup down. "I spent 3 years letting him blame me partly because I understood it. Because some part of me thought, if he needs somewhere to put it, and I'm still here, and she isn't, maybe that's the least I can do." He looked up at her. "That was wrong. You told me that. But I understand it better now. Why I let it go on as long as I did." She looked at him across the table, at this man who had been carrying two kinds of grief simultaneously, his own and the shape of someone else's that had been pressed into him like a wound, and felt the particular difficult tenderness of someone watching another person arrive at last at a true thing. "Eileen would not have wanted that for you," she said, quietly. Not as a comfort, but as a fact she was reasonably certain of, based on what she had pieced together about the woman from the stories told, and the objects kept, and the way Cord had loved and continued to love her, even through the grief. He was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said. "She wouldn't have." He looked at the shelf above the fireplace, where the ring sat in its place. "She would have told me to stop being an idiot about it a good while ago." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Barely there. She had a direct way of saying things. "Sounds familiar," Wren said. He looked at her then, and the thing at the corner of his mouth completed itself into something she could properly call a smile. Not wide, not performed, just real. The kind of smile that appears on a face that has remembered how. She held it for a moment, receiving it, before she looked back at the table. Outside, the evening was settling in over the valley, the light going long and copper across the pasture, the horses moving slow in the near field. Everything ordinary, everything quietly, as it should be. On a morning in late autumn, when the light came in low and golden through the kitchen window, and the smell of the first serious cold was beginning to move in off the open flats, she was at the table correcting the children's exercises from the day before when Cord came in from the barn and stood in the kitchen doorway. He was holding something. She looked up. It was a book, smaller than the one she carried, but the same kind, a schoolroom reader, its cover plain, its pages fresh and uncracked, still carrying the particular smell of new paper. He held it out to her without preamble. "Ordered it from the post rider," he said. "Figured you'd need more than one, eventually." She looked at the book in his hand. Then she looked at him. He was watching her with that steady, full attention. And there was something in his face she had learned to recognize over the weeks they had been building this thing together. Not performance, not declaration, not the kind of emotion that announces itself loudly. Something quieter, something that was simply and completely there. She took the book from his hand. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and went back to the barn. She set the new book beside the old one on the table, the cracked spine and the fresh one side by side, the worn and the new. And she put her hands flat on both of them and looked at them for a moment the way she had looked at things for most of her adult life, with attention, with the patience to see what was actually there rather than what she expected or feared. What was actually there was this: 2 books on a kitchen table in a house that smelled of fire and sage and good wood, in a valley where the land went wide and open to a horizon that never quite came closer no matter how long you walked toward it. A shelf with a ring on it. 3 chairs on the porch. The sound of horses in the yard, and boots crossing gravel toward the barn with the unhurried certainty of a man who knew exactly where he was going, and was not in a hurry to be anywhere else. Outside, the wind moved through the yard the way it always did, indifferent, enormous, and entirely at home in the wide country that had existed long before any of them arrived and would go on long after. It did not care about debts or records or the careful damage that small men did to larger souls. It simply moved, carrying dust and the smell of coming cold and the distant sound of the land breathing. Wren Calloway listened to it for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. She was at last exactly where she had chosen to be. The winter settled in slowly that year, the way winters do in wide open country, not all at once but by degrees, each morning a little colder than the last, the ground hardening by increments, the creek running slower and then slower still along its banks. The light changed too, going thinner and more horizontal, lying long across the land in a way that made everything look both farther away and more precisely itself. Wren had never lived through a winter in country like this, and she found it beautiful in a way she had not expected. Not the soft, muffled beauty of snow in close-built places, but something more austere and somehow more honest, the land stripped down to what it actually was without the softening of green. She learned to layer her clothing before going out in the mornings. She learned which corner of the barn stayed warmest and moved the lesson chairs there on the coldest days, the children bundled into their coats, their breath making small clouds in the cold air as they read. She learned that Cord checked on the horses twice in the night when the temperature dropped significantly, rising without complaint at hours she only knew about because she sometimes heard his boots on the floor and lay awake listening to him move through the house and back to bed, the particular sound of a man doing what needed to be done without requiring acknowledgement for doing it. She found, to her own mild surprise, that she did not find the winter hard. She found it clarifying. There was something about the reduced palette of the season, the grays and browns, the spare black lines of the fence posts against the pale sky, that made the warm things inside stand out more precisely. The fire in the kitchen, the circle of lamplight on the table in the evenings, the sound of another person breathing in the next room. These things, which in warmer months were pleasant background, became in winter more essential, more noticeable in the way that water is more noticeable when you have been thirsty. She thought about this sometimes, in the early mornings before the house woke. She sat at the kitchen table with the 2 books in front of her, the old one and the new one, the cracked and the fresh. And she thought about what it meant to finally be in a place where the warm things felt earned. She had lived for a long time in a kind of voluntary coldness, keeping herself at a distance from anything that could be taken, anything that would cost her something when it was gone. It was a reasonable strategy. She did not regret having used it exactly. It had kept her intact through years that might otherwise have broken her, but there was a difference between intact and alive. She had been intact for a long time. She was only now, slowly and without ceremony, learning to be the other thing. Cord noticed the way he noticed most things, quietly, and without making a production of it. One evening, when she had laughed at something Eli had said during the lesson that afternoon and was telling Cord about it at supper, she became aware midway through the telling that he was watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the careful measuring look, not the considering look, something more direct than either of those. Something that had allowed itself to arrive without being managed. She finished the story. He laughed, actually laughed, the sound she had come to prize precisely because it was not performed. And then the laughter settled, and he was still watching her with that expression. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. Then, after a moment, "You look different than when you arrived." She considered this. Different how? He thought about it with the same seriousness he brought to everything. "Less like someone waiting for the next thing to go wrong," he said, finally. It was not a graceful way of saying it, but it was accurate, and accuracy was always what he aimed for. She looked at him across the table. The candle, not the original stub that had burned down weeks ago, but one of a series of replacements that had appeared regularly without comment, was burning between them, throwing its small, reliable light across the kitchen the way it did every evening. "So do you," she said. He received this without comment, which was how he received most things that were important. He looked at his coffee cup. Then he looked at her. Then he looked at the window, at the dark and the cold outside, and she could see him thinking about something, working through it with the slow thoroughness of a man who does not reach conclusions quickly, but reaches them accurately. "I want to ask you something," he said. His voice was careful, the way it was careful when he was near something he considered significant. "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The contract that brought you here, the original one." He paused. "It was a practical arrangement, for both of us. That was what it was." "Yes," she said. "I'd like it to be something else," he said. "If you'd want that." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the yard with its usual indifference. The fire was doing its work. The ring was on the shelf. The 2 books were on the table. Everything was exactly as it had been 10 minutes ago, and everything was different. She looked at him for a long moment, and he let himself be looked at, which was, for a man like Cord Mallory, a more significant gesture than it might have appeared. He sat still, and he met her gaze, and he did not manage his expression, or brace himself, or retreat into that careful stillness. He just waited, with the patience of someone who has learned that some things cannot be rushed, and should not be. "Yes," she said, "I'd want that." He nodded once, slowly, the way he nodded when something had been settled that mattered. Then he picked up his coffee cup. She picked up hers. The candle burned between them, and outside the winter wind carried its cold across the valley, and inside the kitchen smelled of fire and good wood and the dried sage still tied above the window. And it was, in the most complete and ordinary and permanent sense of the word, home. She was, at last, exactly where she had chosen to be.